In the glittering world of the ultra-rich, some women are trophies. Amelia Sterling was meant to be a monument. For 15 years, she stood as the silent, elegant wife of billionaire tycoon Richard Sterling, a woman who weathered his public scandals with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. But dignity has its limits, and loyalty has its price. When Richard makes the fatal error of publicly replacing her with his young mistress at the city's most important gala, he assumes he has finally broken her. He is wrong. Tonight, Amelia Sterling will not be a silent monument. She will be a storm, and she will be wearing red. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a galaxy of man-made stars, a universe of glittering diamonds, shimmering silks, and blinding ambition, all orbiting the gravitational pull of old money and new power. This was the annual Metropolitan Arts Gala, the undisputed pinnacle of New York City's philanthropic calendar. To be here was to be someone. To be seen here was to matter. And no one mattered more tonight, it seemed, than Richard Sterling and the woman on his arm. Richard, the CEO of Sterling Global Acquisitions, was a man carved from granite and arrogance. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo tailored with surgical precision. He moved through the crowd not like a guest, but like a feudal lord surveying his lands. Every handshake was a bestowal of favor, every laugh a calculated display of dominance. And on his arm, clinging to him like the most exquisite of parasites, was Isabella Dubois. She was 2 decades his junior, a former model whose career had been jump-started by Richard's patronage. Her dress was a cascade of silver sequins, a direct challenge to the crystal chandeliers above. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with wool-hungry eyes that darted around the room, cataloguing every rival, every socialite, every wife she had successfully supplanted, if only for the evening. She was the living, breathing symbol of Richard's power, a man so wealthy, so influential, he didn't need to hide his indiscretions. He could parade them on the most public of stages. They were a picture of triumph, a king and his chosen consort holding court. Darling Isabella purred, her French accent thick and deliberate, her lips close to Richard's ear. The Vanderbilts are staring. I think Beatrice is about to have an aneurysm. Her pearls look positively yellow with envy. Richard chuckled a low, rumbling sound of pure satisfaction. He squeezed her hand. Let them stare. They're yesterday's news. We're the headline. He scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the clusters of whispering guests. The whispers were for him, he knew, for them, about his audacity, about his spectacular new plaything. He thrived on it. It was better than any multi-billion-dollar merger. A junior associate from his firm, a nervous young man named David, approached them, balancing 2 glasses of champagne. Mr. Sterling, Ms. Dubois. An absolute vision, as always. Thank you, David, Richard said dismissively, taking both glasses and handing one to Isabella. He didn't introduce her. He didn't need to. Her role was self-evident. Anything to report from the floor. Just that everyone is talking about the new Hong Kong Tower, sir. A brilliant move. The board is ecstatic. The board is paid to be ecstatic, Richard said, his eyes already drifting past the young man, searching for a more important conversation to join. It was in that moment of supreme, unassailable confidence that the universe decided to shift on its axis. The great oak doors of the ballroom, which had been closed for the past half hour, swung open. It was an unusual occurrence, once the main cocktail hour was underway, and the sudden influx of light and sound from the hotel lobby drew a few curious glances. One glance turned into two. Two turned into a dozen. A ripple of silence began to spread from the entrance, a wave that slowly extinguished the hum of chatter in its path. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet playing a Vivaldi piece suddenly sounded loud and intrusive in the spreading quiet. Richard, annoyed by the interruption, turned his head. His smile was still fixed on his face, a relic of the conversation he had just abandoned. He expected to see a late-coming politician or a diver-like celebrity making a deliberately tardy entrance. He did not expect to see his wife. Amelia Sterling stood framed in the doorway, a portrait of impossible elegance. For 15 years, she had been the perfect corporate wife, tastefully dressed in muted beiges and navy blues, her hair in a sensible chignon, her presence as quiet and reliable as the dividends from a blue-chip stock. She was the ghost at the feast. The silent partner who organized the dinners, managed the households, raised their 2 children, and absorbed the ambient humiliation of his affairs with a stoic, almost unnerving grace. He hadn't seen her in 3 weeks, not since he'd told her he was taking Isabella to the gala, and that it would be better for everyone if she stayed at their Connecticut estate. He had expected and received her usual quiet acquiescence. But the woman in the doorway was not that Amelia. This woman was a phoenix, a flame, a reckoning. She was wearing a dress the color of arterial blood. It was a simple, devastatingly effective column of red silk that clung to her figure in a way that was both elegant and provocative. It left her shoulders bare, showcasing the graceful line of her collarbone. Her hair, usually constrained, was down-styled in soft waves that cascaded over one shoulder. She wore a necklace of raw, unpolished diamonds that looked like captured starlight, and her lips were painted in a matching, defiant shade of red. She wasn't just wearing a dress. She was wearing a statement. It was a declaration of war styled by couture. The room, which had fallen quiet, now held a collective bated breath. This was not a scandal. This was theatre. High, grand, and terrible. Amelia's eyes, a cool, clear blue, swept across the ballroom. She wasn't looking for anyone. She wasn't searching for him. Her gaze was serene, regal, as if she were the one hosting this event, and everyone else was merely an attendee. She took a single, deliberate step into the room, and then another. The doors swung shut behind her, sealing them all inside. Richard stood frozen, the champagne glass in his hand, trembling slightly. The blood had drained from his face, leaving behind a pallid mask of shock. The arm he had so possessively wrapped around Isabella's waist went slack. He felt a sudden cold dread snake its way up his spine, a primal fear he hadn't experienced since he was a child. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Richard. Who is that? Isabella's voice was a sharp, brittle thing. The purr was gone, replaced by the hiss of a threatened cat. She already knew, of course. The resemblance to the faded photos she had seen in Richard's study was there, but this version was in vivid, terrifying color. Richard couldn't answer. He couldn't tear his eyes away from his wife. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time. The quiet, mousy woman he had married for her good breeding and social connections, the woman he had so carelessly discarded, was gone. In her place was this creature of fawn and ice, a woman who held the entire room captive with nothing more than her presence. Amelia began to move. She didn't march towards them. She drifted a scarlet ghost moving through a sea of black and white. She smiled at people she passed, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. She touched the arm of Margaret Chen, the museum's formidable director. She exchanged a few words with old Judge Peterson, who looked at her with newfound admiration. She was navigating the room with a social grace he had forgotten she possessed. She wasn't making a scene. She was claiming her territory. She was reminding everyone in that room who exactly the real Mrs. Sterling was. Every step she took was a hammer blow to Richard's carefully constructed reality. Every smile she bestowed on someone else was a twist of the knife in his gut. He had wanted to be the headline, but he was realizing with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was no longer the main story. He and the beautiful young woman beside him were suddenly, irrevocably old news. The real event had just begun. And as Amelia drew closer, her serene blue eyes finally briefly met his. Across the crowded room, he understood that her arrival wasn't an act of desperation. It was the opening move in a war he never even knew had been declared. The silence Amelia had created was a living thing, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. Then, as she moved deeper into the gala, the vacuum was filled by a new sound, the frenzied electric buzz of high society gossip. It started as hushed murmurs, hands covering mouths, heads leaning in close. It quickly grew into a low, persistent hum, the sound of 100 tiny, vicious engines starting up all at once. My God, is that Amelia Sterling? I thought she was in. What did he say? A wellness retreat. That dress. It's a custom Oscar de la Renta. I saw it on the runway. He must have pulled it for her personally. Look at Richard. He looks like he's seen a ghost. He's seeing something far worse than a ghost, darling. He's seeing his future, and it's wearing red. Richard heard it all. The whispers lapped at him like tiny, venomous waves eroding the foundation of his power. He was used to being talked about, but with awe, with envy. This was different. This was mockery. He was the butt of the joke, a punchline in his own life story. His knuckles were white where he gripped his champagne flute. Beside him, Isabella was stiff with fury. Her perfectly manicured fingers were digging into his arm, her earlier playful cling, now a desperate, painful vice. Richard, do something, she hissed, her voice low and tight. She is humiliating us. She is humiliating me. Everyone is laughing. But Richard couldn't move. He was paralyzed by a potent cocktail of rage, confusion, and a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion, fear. Amelia was supposed to be broken. She was supposed to be in their sprawling, empty house in Greenwich, weeping into her tea, another casualty of his appetites. That was the established order of their universe. Her presence here in this dress, with that look of serene confidence, was a cosmic anomaly. It defied all the rules. Amelia continued her slow, deliberate procession. She was a master strategist, moving her piece across the board with unhurried precision. She didn't look at them again. She didn't have to. She was systematically greeting the very people Richard needed to impress. She paused to speak with Kenji Tanaka, the Japanese tech mogul Richard had been courting for a joint venture. She shared a laugh with him, her head tilted back, the diamonds on her neck catching the light. Tanaka, a notoriously stoic man, laughed with her, a broad, genuine smile. Richard felt a lurch of panic in his stomach. He had been trying to get a one-on-one with Tanaka for 6 months. Then she moved toward a small group that included Marcus Thorne. Thorne was Richard's oldest and most bitter business rival, a shark who smelled blood in the water from a mile away. Amelia extended her hand to him. Marcus, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the now quieter room. How wonderful to see you. You're looking well. Thorn, a wolfish grin spreading across his face, took her hand and held it for a moment too long. Amelia, my dear, the pleasure is all mine. You are a revelation. His eyes flicked over to Richard, a glint of pure, unadulterated schadenfreude in them. He was enjoying every second of Richard's public castration. This was Amelia's strategy, Richard realized with dawning horror. It wasn't a hysterical, emotional confrontation he could easily dismiss. It was a targeted, strategic dismantling of his professional life. She was reminding every power player in this room that she was the one with the history, the legacy, the name. Isabella was a dalliance. Amelia was the dynasty. Finally, the spell broke, urged on by another vicious pinch from Isabella. Richard moved. He set his glass down with a thud, straightened his jacket, and began to stride towards his wife, a thunderous expression on his face. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. "I'll handle this," he muttered to Isabella, leaving her standing alone, a beautiful sequined statue of irrelevance. He reached Amelia just as she was turning away from Marcus Thorn. He grabbed her arm, his grip far too tight. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he growled, keeping his voice low, but failing to hide the fury that contorted his features. Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't try to pull away. She simply turned her cool blue eyes on him. Up close, he could see the fine lines around them. Lines he had put there, but tonight they didn't look like lines of sadness. They looked like battle scars. "I'm attending a gala." "Richard," she replied, her voice even. "The same as you. I believe my name is on the invitation. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Sterling. Or did you have them print a new one?" Her calmness infuriated him more than tears ever could. "You were supposed to be in Connecticut. We discussed this." "No," she said, her voice dropping a fraction, becoming a blade of ice. "You told me what you had decided. There was no discussion. I've merely decided to renegotiate the terms of our arrangement." Marcus Thorn, who had been lingering nearby, let out a soft chuckle. Richard shot him a murderous glare. "This is not the time or the place, Amelia." "It seems to be the perfect time and place," she said, glancing around the room. "Everyone is here, all our friends, your colleagues, your guest." She let her eyes drift for a second toward Isabella, a flicker of something unreadable in them, before returning her gaze to Richard's. "It's so much more efficient this way." It was then that he noticed it. Tucked under her arm was a sleek crimson leather portfolio perfectly matching her dress. It looked thin, holding perhaps only a few dozen pages. But in the context of her words, of her presence here, it suddenly seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. What was in it? Divorce papers, embarrassing photos, or something worse? The renegotiation she mentioned suddenly sounded less like a marital dispute and more like a corporate takeover. "What is that?" he demanded, nodding toward the portfolio. A faint, mysterious smile played on her lips. "Just some light reading. For later. Perhaps something to share with my new friends." She patted Marcus Thorn's arm. "Marcus was just telling me how much he admires your aggressive business tactics. He's fascinated by the Phoenix Project." Richard felt the blood turn to ice in his veins. The Phoenix Project. A highly leveraged, ethically dubious deal he had pushed through with creative accounting and a series of shell corporations. It was his greatest triumph, but also his greatest vulnerability. No one was supposed to know the real details of its structure, certainly not Amelia. How could she possibly? His mind reeled back. 3 months ago. The late nights, the files he'd brought home from the office, carelessly leaving them on his study desk. The hushed, angry phone calls he'd taken in the garden, thinking no one was listening. He had assumed she was oblivious, absorbed in her charities and garden clubs. He had underestimated her. He had committed the greatest sin of any predator. He had forgotten that his prey had a mind of its own. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snarled, a desperate bluff. "Don't I?" Amelia's smile feigned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've had so much free time lately, Richard. An abundance of it. It's amazing what a woman can learn when she's no longer occupied with fluffing her husband's ego." She gently but firmly extracted her arm from his grasp. Her touch was cool and final. "Now, if you'll excuse me," she said, her voice returning to its pleasant conversational tone. "I believe they are about to serve the salmon, and I see an old friend from my Vassar days over there. Her husband just happens to sit on the board of the SEC. We have so much to catch up on." She turned and walked away, the red silk of her dress flowing behind her, like the cape of a matador who had just delivered the first deep cut to the bull. Richard stood rooted to the spot, watching her go. The noise of the gala, the music, the laughter, it all faded into a dull roar. All he could hear was the frantic pounding of his own heart. The carefully constructed world he had built around himself, a world of power, control, and consequence-free indulgence, was beginning to fracture. He had walked into this ballroom a king. He was rapidly becoming a fool. And as he watched his wife, this stranger in a red dress, charm his rivals and allies alike, he knew with a sickening certainty that this was not the end of his humiliation. It was just the beginning. The spectacle of Richard Sterling being publicly neutered by his own wife was an intoxicating drug for the city's elite. The gossip, once a murmur, had intensified into a palpable, crackling energy. Every eye in the room was now engaged in a constant, furtive ballet, darting between the 3 points of their drama triangle, the triumphant wife, the crumbling husband, and the increasingly desperate mistress. Isabella Dubois was not accustomed to being irrelevant. She had spent the last 5 years of her life leveraging her beauty into a weapon, securing a position at Richard's side that was the envy of every social climber in Manhattan. Now she stood alone near a towering floral arrangement, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, watching her future dissolve. Men who would normally flock to her side now gave her a wide berth, as if she were contagious. Women who had once shot her envious glares now looked at her with something far worse, pity. She watched Amelia, now seated at a prime table, a table Richard had arranged ironically laughing with the SEC board member's wife. She looked radiant, powerful, untouchable. Isabella's beauty, so potent just an hour ago, now felt cheap and gaudy next to Amelia's timeless elegance. The silver sequins of her dress, which had felt like armor, now felt like a jester's costume. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her. She had given up everything for this life. She had alienated her family, abandoned her friends, and endured the sneers of society, all for the promise of becoming the next Mrs. Sterling, a promise Richard had whispered to her in lavish hotel suites from Paris to Tokyo, a promise that now seemed as hollow as his shocked expression. She had to do something. She had to reclaim the narrative. Spotting Richard standing shell-shocked and alone, she composed herself, pasted a dazzling smile on her face, and glided toward him. Her walk was a performance, a deliberate sway of the hips, designed to remind him, and everyone watching of what he was choosing to abandon. "Darling," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. She looped her arm through his, pressing herself against him. "There you are. I was getting lonely. Let's go and get a drink. Forget about all this unpleasantness." Richard flinched at her touch as if it were a hot iron. His mind was a maelstrom of fear and fury, dominated by two words: Phoenix Project. How much did Amelia know? How much could she prove the portfolio she carried was a ticking time bomb? Not now. "Isabella," he snapped, shaking her arm off with a rough, impatient gesture. It was the first time he had ever been so brusque with her in public, and the rejection stung more than a slap. "What do you mean, not now?" she demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. "Richard, she is making a fool of you. Of us, are you going to let her?" "You don't understand," he muttered, his eyes scanning the room, hunting for Amelia, for the crimson portfolio. "This is more complicated than you think. It is not complicated at all." Isabella insisted, her desperation making her reckless. She is a pathetic old woman, trying to cling to what she's lost. You need to put her in her place. Show everyone who you are with. Show them who has won. Her words, meant to galvanize him, had the opposite effect. Pathetic old woman. Looking at Amelia across the room, exuding more power and grace than he'd ever seen. The phrase was apart, and who has won? An hour ago, he would have laughed at the question. Now the answer seemed terrifyingly unclear, but Isabella, blinded by panic, would not be deterred. She saw her dream slipping away and made a fatal miscalculation. She decided that if Richard wouldn't act, she would. She would confront the source of her humiliation head on. With a look of fierce determination, she turned and began to march across the ballroom directly towards Amelia's table. "Isabella, no," Richard hissed, but it was too late. She was already halfway there. A new wave of silence fell as the crowd sensed the impending collision. This was the confrontation they had all been waiting for. Amelia saw her coming. She paused in her conversation, placing her napkin on the table. There was no fear in her eyes, only a sort of weary resignation, like a queen about to entertain the court fool. Isabella arrived at the table, her posture rigid with indignation. She didn't bother to address the other guests. Her focus was entirely on Amelia. "I think you've had your fun," Isabella began, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "You've made your little scene. It's time for you to go home." Amelia looked up at her, tilting her head slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone polite, but laced with steel. "Have we been introduced? I'm Amelia Sterling." She extended a hand, a gesture of such exquisite condescending civility that it was a slap in the face. Isabella ignored the hand. "I know who you are. You're the past. I'm the future. Richard is with me now. You need to accept that and leave with some dignity." The word dignity hung in the air, a spectacular misfire. Amelia let a small, pitying smile touch her lips. "Dignity," she repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "That's an interesting choice. Tell me, Ms. Dubois, is it dignified to accept jewelry bought with funds from a joint marital account? Is it dignified to vacation in homes that are half owned by the woman you're trying to usurp? I'm only asking because the legal definitions of these things are about to become very relevant to you." The color drained from Isabella's face. She had always assumed Richard's wealth was an infinite amorphous resource. She had never considered the legal structures that underpinned it, the lines that divided his from theirs. Amelia continued, her voice never rising. Yet each word was a precision strike. You see, you think this is a competition for a man. That's your first mistake. I am not competing. I am liquidating an asset. A very poorly performing asset, I might add. She glanced over at Richard, who was now frozen in the middle of the room watching the scene unfold in horror. You believe you've won a prize, Amelia said, her eyes returning to Isabella's stunned face. But all you've done is chained yourself to the anchor I am about to cut loose. I genuinely wish you the best of luck with him. Based on his recent financials, you're going to need it. She then picked up her wine glass, took a delicate sip, and turned back to her table mates. Now where were we? Cynthia. You were telling me about your son's startup. It was a dismissal so complete, so utterly devastating that Isabella was left speechless. She stood there exposed and humiliated, the entire room watching her defeat. She had intended to put Amelia in her place, but instead Amelia had shown her that she didn't even have a place to begin with. She was a footnote in a story that was far bigger and more complex than she had ever imagined. Tears of rage and shame welled in her eyes. She shot a desperate, pleading look at Richard, begging him to intervene to save her. But Richard was no longer looking at her. His eyes were locked on Amelia, on the crimson portfolio that sat beside her plate like a harbinger of doom. The beautiful, fiery mistress, who had once fueled his ego, was now just noise, a distraction from the real and present danger that his wife represented. Defeated Isabella turned and fled, weaving blindly through the tables of staring guests, her silver dress now a beacon of her humiliation. Richard didn't even watch her go. He took a staggering step towards Amelia's table, his mind racing. Financials. Liquidating an asset. What the hell did she know? What was in that portfolio? He had to find out. He had to stop her. His reputation, his company, his entire life depended on it. The battle for his mistress was lost. The war for his survival had just entered a terrifying new phase. The gala, once a glittering celebration of art and influence, had transformed into Richard Sterling's personal purgatory. The air was thick with his disgrace. Isabella's tearful, panicked exit had been the undercard. The main event was clearly still to come. Richard could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, watching, judging, waiting for his next move. They were no longer just guests. They were spectators in a coliseum, and he was the gladiator who had just dropped his shield. His mind was a frantic cacophony. Financials, liquidating, SEC. Amelia's words echoed in his head, each one a drumbeat of impending doom. He had to get to her. He had to get that portfolio. He started towards her table, his movements stiff and clumsy. He looked like a man wading through deep water. The whispers followed him, a sibilant, predatory chorus. As he approached, Amelia looked up. The polite conversational mask she had worn was gone. Her expression was now one of cold, hard clarity. She saw him coming, and she was ready. She deliberately placed her hand on the crimson portfolio beside her plate. It was not a threat. It was a promise. "Amelia, we need to talk," he said, his voice a ragged whisper as he reached the table. "Now, outside." "I don't think so, Richard," she replied calmly, not bothering to stand. "I'm rather enjoying my dinner, and this fascinating conversation." She smiled at the SEC board member's wife, who looked down at her plate, suddenly very interested in her Chilean sea bass. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire. "Don't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. The alpha predator was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you're planning, we can work it out. Privately." Amelia tilted her head. Privately. Is that how you handled your affair with Isabella? Privately. Is that how you handled the last 3 before her? You made your choices in public, Richard. It seems only fitting that you should face the consequences in public as well. From the corner of his eye, Richard saw a figure approaching. It was Marcus Thorne, his rival, a smug, predatory grin on his face. He was ostensibly coming to greet a colleague at the next table, but his trajectory was designed for maximum impact. He paused by Amelia's chair. "Everything all right here, Amelia?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "You look like you're being bothered." His eyes gleamed as he looked at Richard's pale, sweat-slicked face. Before Richard could snarl at him to get lost, Amelia answered. She gave Thorne a dazzling smile. "Not at all, Marcus. Richard and I were just having a fascinating discussion about corporate transparency." It was the perfect poison-tipped arrow. "Ah, transparency," Thorne said, savouring the word. "A noble concept. So rare these days, especially on projects as complex as the Phoenix Project. I've always wondered how you managed to structure that deal, Richard. Truly a work of art. Almost magical the way those liabilities seemed to just disappear." Richard felt his heart hammer against his ribs. It was happening. Right here. The controlled strategic demolition he had feared was beginning. "Marcus, this is a private family matter," Richard choked out. "It stopped being a family matter, Richard, when you started using family assets to finance it," Amelia said, her voice cutting through his defense. She finally opened the crimson portfolio. The sound of the latch clicking open was as loud as a gunshot in the silent tableau. She didn't pull out a stack of documents. She slid out a single glossy sheet of paper and placed it on the table. It was an infographic, simple and brutally clear. It showed a web of interconnected boxes representing shell corporations with arrows indicating the flow of money. It looked like a page from a business school textbook on money laundering. At the top in bold letters it read, "The Phoenix Project, a simplified flow of funds." In the center was a box labeled Sterling Global Acquisitions. Arrows flowed from it to a dozen smaller boxes with names like Apex Holdings Limited, Cayman Islands, and Viridian Solutions, Panama. And from those boxes, arrows pointed towards a single final destination, a box labeled RS Personal Discretionary Fund. It was a perfect, elegant summary of his grandest crime. A fraud so audacious he never imagined it could be untangled, let alone distilled onto a single, easily digestible page. "I was always so impressed with your creativity, Richard." Amelia said, her voice conversational, as if she were discussing a painting. She tapped a finger on the chart. "The way you used the company's pension fund as collateral to secure the initial loan from the German bank was particularly brilliant. A bit illegal under ERISA statutes, of course, but audacious. I had to hire 3 forensic accountants to unravel it all. They said it was the most elegant fraud they'd ever seen." A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. Pension fund. That was the sacred cow. The one line you did not cross. Marcus Thorne's eyes widened. He leaned in, staring at the infographic with the intensity of a treasure hunter who had just found his map. "My God," he breathed. "Is that the pension fund, Richard? You magnificent bastard." It wasn't a compliment. It was an epitaph. Richard stared at the paper, at the neat lines and boxes that represented his imminent ruin. He couldn't breathe. The entire ballroom seemed to tilt the chandeliers, swaying like angry gods. This was it. The killing blow. It wasn't just about divorce or losing half his fortune. This was about prison. This was about utter, complete annihilation. The name Sterling, a name he had built into an empire, would be synonymous with Madoff. He looked at Amelia, truly looked at her. The years of quiet endurance, of silent meals and forced smiles, he had seen it all as weakness. He saw it now for what it was. Observation. Data collection. She had been sitting in the quiet center of his life, watching, listening, and remembering everything. The portfolio wasn't a threat she had just conceived. It was a strategy she had been building for years, waiting for the perfect moment to execute. His public flaunting of Isabella wasn't the cause of her attack. It was merely the trigger. "Amelia, please," he croaked. The word was pathetic, a beggar's plea. All the power, all the arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, terrified man. "Don't." Amelia looked at him, and for the first time he saw not anger, but a profound, sorrowful emptiness in her eyes. It was the look of a woman who had already mourned the death of her love, her marriage, and the man she thought she had married. "Don't," she repeated, her voice soft but unforgiving. "Don't what, Richard? Don't show them what you are. You were so eager to do that just an hour ago." She picked up the infographic. Her gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of his partners, his rivals, the journalists from the Wall Street Journal, and the Times who were present. She held it up not provocatively, but as a simple statement of fact. "He told me it was for the best if I stayed home. Tonight," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "He said my presence would be awkward. It turns out he was right." With that, she slid the paper back into its crimson sheath, clicked it shut, and stood up. The execution was complete. She had not only destroyed him, she had made him a participant in his own destruction. She had used his own arrogance as the weapon to bring him down. The click of the crimson portfolio's latch was not merely a sound. It was a judgment. It was the snap of a hangman's trapdoor, the thud of a gavel in a courtroom, from which there was no appeal, the final metallic closing of a coffin lid on a life that had until this moment been defined by limitless horizons. Richard Sterling, the Titan, the Predator. The king stood in the glittering center of the grand ballroom, utterly, irrevocably broken. The infographic was gone, hidden back inside its leather sheath, but its image was seared onto the retinas of every person in that room. It was a ghost of evidence that would haunt every future transaction, every board meeting, every whispered conversation bearing his name. The words pension fund and fraud hung in the air invisible, but with the suffocating density of smoke from a fire that could never be extinguished, poisoning everything he had ever built. Amelia stood a figure of impossible composure. The red of her dress was a stark, bloody slash against the opulent golds and creams of the room. It was the color of defiance, of sacrifice, and of victory. She was no longer just a woman, a wife, or a socialite. She had become an event, a human cataclysm that had fundamentally reshaped the social and financial landscape of the city in the space of a single hour. She had not raised her voice, she had not thrown a drink, she had not shed a tear. She had simply presented the truth, and the truth had been enough to bring an empire to its knees. Richard watched her, his mind a maelstrom of denial and dawning horror. It was like watching a film of his own life being run in reverse, everything he had painstakingly acquired, being spooled back into nothingness. The Hong Kong Tower, a monument to his ego that scraped the sky, now seemed a fragile house of cards. The joint venture with Tanaka, the key to his dominance in Asia, was now a dead dream. He could almost feel the Japanese mogul's icy withdrawal across the room. The respect of his board, a group of men he had ruled through fear and avarice, would curdle into self-serving panic by sunrise. The fear of his rivals. The fuel on which he had run for decades would be replaced by the circling, gleeful hunger of sharks who smelled his blood in the water. Everything he was, everything he had evaporated in the face of a single, elegantly designed sheet of paper held by the one person in the world he had deemed utterly powerless. All that was left was the raw, primal, and deeply unfamiliar terror of consequence. A sound tore from his throat, a choked, guttural noise that was part sob, part groan of a collapsing structure. He staggered forward, his hand outstretched a reflexive gesture towards the woman who had just annihilated him. Amelia. The name was a ragged plea. His wild eyes darted around, searching for an anchor in the spinning chaos of his reality. They fell on Isabella. She had crept back to the edge of the room, unable to flee the morbid gravity of the implosion. She stood half-hidden by a marble column, her face a mask of horror and dawning selfish comprehension. In her wide, terrified eyes, he didn't see sympathy. He saw her own calculations running her own future, being reassessed and found wanting. She wasn't just losing a benefactor. She was witnessing the fall of the empire she had bet her entire life on inheriting. In that instant, all of Richard's fear, shame, and incandescent fury coalesced and demanded a target, a scapegoat for a catastrophe that was so profoundly his own making. His mind, incapable of accepting his own agency in his ruin, latched onto the most convenient target. His wild, terrified eyes locked onto her. "You," he roared. The sound was animalistic, stripped of all civility, raw with the panic of a trapped beast. He pointed a trembling finger at her, the accusation a physical force. "This is your fault. All of it. You and your greed, your constant, endless pushing. When will you leave her? Richard, I deserve more, Richard. If it wasn't for you for flaunting you, none of this would have happened." Isabella recoiled, as if he had physically struck her. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the onlookers. This was a new, fascinating layer of cruelty. To be the discarded mistress was a common enough tragedy in this world. To be publicly humiliated was a more acute pain. But to be publicly blamed for a man's crimes, seconds after he had just been exposed as a felon, and after he had disowned his wife for you, that was a special circle of social hell reserved for only the most spectacular of falls from grace. "Get away from me," Richard snarled, his voice cracking with a rising tide of hysteria. He needed her gone. He needed to erase the symbol of his fatal arrogance. "I never want to see your face again. Get out." He was a king, abdicating his throne, and in his final pathetic act of power, ordering the execution of his court favorite. Isabella stood frozen for a second, her beautiful face once a portrait of confidence crumbling into utter devastation. The silver dress, once a symbol of her conquest, now seemed like a cheap, glittering shroud. With a strangled sob that was barely audible, she turned and fled. Not gliding but stumbling through the tables of staring guests, a pariah running from her own public immolation. But Richard barely registered her departure. He had jettisoned his mistress like so much excess baggage from a sinking ship. His focus, his entire being, was now singularly, desperately directed at the one person who held his fate in her hands. He stumbled the last few feet toward Amelia, his legs barely holding him. The world had shrunk to the space between them. The carefully constructed facade of the millionaire husband, the powerful CEO. The master of the universe had not just cracked. It had disintegrated, blown away like dust, to reveal the weak, terrified, pathetic man who had always been hiding underneath. And then in a final complete surrender of pride and power, he fell to his knees. The sound of his expensive tailored trousers hitting the polished marble floor echoed in the cavernous silence. Richard Sterling, a man who had never begged, who had never knelt to anyone, was on his knees at his wife's feet. "Amelia, please," he wept. The tears, once an impossible concept, came now in a hot, shameful torrent, streaming down his face and mixing with the sweat on his brow. He reached out, not for her hand, but for the hem of her red dress, his fingers shaking so violently they could barely grasp the silk. "Please don't do this. I'm sorry. My God, Amelia, I am so sorry." The room held a collective, bated breath. This was a sight no one had ever imagined. It was grotesque, it was pitiful, and it was utterly, completely riveting. Marcus Thorne watched with a look of grim, vindicated satisfaction. This was better than any hostile takeover. She meant nothing. Richard sobbed, the words tumbling out in a desperate, incoherent rush, a confession born not of conscience, but of terror. Nothing. A distraction. An idiotic, meaningless mistake. It's you, Amelia. It has always, always been you. I see that now. I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I took you for granted. I took everything for granted. He looked up at her, his face a ruin of tears and desperation, a caricature of remorse. "We can fix this." He pleaded, his voice a frantic whisper. "I'll do anything. I'll give you everything. The house in Greenwich, the apartment in Paris, the accounts, a new contract in your favor, ironclad. Whatever you want. Just don't release that information. Don't ruin me. Please. Don't ruin us." Amelia looked down at the man kneeling before her, clinging to her dress like a drowning child. She saw the wreckage of their marriage, the smouldering ruins of a life they had built, and that he had so carelessly, so consistently set on fire. She felt a flicker of something deep inside her, a faint tremor. But it wasn't pity. It was the faint, ghostly echo of a love that had died a long, slow death from neglect and 1,000 tiny cuts. It was the final, shuddering sigh of a ghost finally leaving the house it had haunted for too long. She reached down, her movements, slow and deliberate. For a wild, hopeful second, he thought she might help him up, that she might show him mercy. Instead, she gently, firmly pried his trembling fingers from her dress. Her touch was not angry, not vengeful. It was detached, clinical, as if she were handling a contaminated, unfamiliar object that she needed to put down. "Us," she said. Her voice was quiet, preternaturally calm. Yet it carried the weight of 15 years of silent pain, of swallowed humiliations and lonely nights. "There is no us, Richard. You burned that bridge the first time you chose to lie all those years ago. You just kept dancing in the ashes, so mesmerized by your own reflection that you never even thought to notice I couldn't smell the smoke anymore." She looked around the room at all the staring, silent faces, then back down at the broken man at her feet. "You think this is about her?" she asked, and there was a note of genuine, almost academic surprise in her voice. "Or the one before her? Or the money?" or even the simple act of cheating. Richard, this is about the fact that you didn't even see me anymore. For the last 10 years, I could have been a ghost in our own home, and you wouldn't have noticed. I was the silent partner who ran the infrastructure of your life, so you could be free to destroy it. Tonight, I just wanted to make sure you saw me. One last time. He continued to plead, his words becoming a meaningless, pathetic babble of promises and apologies that meant nothing now. Amelia let him weep. She let the world watch him grovel. She let the silence stretch a moment of profound, shared humiliation, cementing the image of his complete and utter downfall in the minds of everyone present. This was the true punishment, more potent than any prison sentence. The loss of his aura. The death of his myth. Then she took a single deliberate step back, creating a chasm of space between them. She held the crimson portfolio in her hand, her last and only connection to him. As for this, she said, her voice cool and clear, as she looked at the portfolio. This is not a negotiating tool. You have nothing left to negotiate with. This is my retirement plan. My severance package from a long and thankless job. A job I am officially resigning from, effective immediately. She turned her back to him, a final, unequivocal act of dismissal. She began to walk towards the great oak doors from which she had made her entrance in what felt like another lifetime. She didn't look back. Her posture was perfect, her steps even and unhurried. The red of her dress was the only vibrant color in a world that had turned to gray for Richard Sterling. She was walking away from her husband, from her marriage, from the life that had been a gilded cage. She was walking towards an unknown future, but it would be hers, bought and paid for with his secrets. She had arrived tonight as a statement. She was leaving as a legend. The doors opened for her as if on command, and she stepped out into the cool, cleansing air of the New York night, leaving behind the ashes of a king and the deafening sound of a silent, shattered ballroom. And so Amelia Sterling walked out of that ballroom, not as a victim, but as the architect of her own liberation. She didn't just get revenge. She reclaimed her power, her name and her future, all in a single, devastatingly elegant move. This wasn't just a story about a cheating husband. It was a masterclass in strategy, proving that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. What did you think of Amelia's final move? Was it brilliant justice or a step too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of epic real-life drama and powerful comebacks, make sure you hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. Don't miss what's coming next.